Roberts.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for appearing here. CPI, as we discussed informally, is something that's very important to a lot of people around Australia. A lot of things based on it. So let me just check my understanding. The Australian Bureau of Statistics produces a set of indices called living cost indexes. These are designed to show the inflation facing specific demographics within the Australian population. Now, as I understand it, your latest indexes, released on the 7th of August, shows the following. Pensioners and beneficiaries have a living cost index of 4.1%. Employees, 6.2%. Aged pensioners, 3.7%. Other welfare, 4.6%. Self-funded retirees, 3.8%. I don't know if that's if they're getting funding self-funded in part or wholly or whatever. Perhaps we can explore that. And the consumer price index is 3.8%. Are they all correct?
They look correct to me, Senator, yes.
Thank you. So my concern is this, Mr Goldsworthy. Is your CPI representative of the inflation that adult working employee Australians are experiencing? The ABS data set 6336 working arrangements, as at August 2023, shows there are 14 million people working for a wage or salary in Australia, including owner-managers of their own business entity. Does that mean small businesses are included in that figure of 14 million? And if so, how many?
Sorry, Senator, I might need to ask you to repeat the question.
The ABS dataset 6336, working arrangements, as at August 2023, shows there are 14 million people working for a wage or salary in Australia. That includes owner-managers of their own business entity. Does that mean small businesses are included in that figure of 14 million? Small businesses and their employees.
For that.
Yeah, we don't have those figures to hand, Senator.
Do you know how many small businesses there are?
No, Senator. We came prepared to talk about questions in relation to the consumer price index.
Yeah, that's where I'm heading. Because I'd like to know how many people depend upon the CPI figure and their various...
So we can certainly take that on notice for you, Senator.
Thank you. Does the employees figure include the 1 million contractors as listed in your characteristics of employment page?
So the employee households, that represents wage earners?
Purely wage earners, no small business, and self-employed, owner-managers.
So it's wherever the main income of households is. So if you're a household and you maybe have a wage earner and someone who receives a pension, if the main income for the household is wages, then they would be counted as in the living cost indexes for employees.
Thank you, Mrs Margaret. I'll just go through the categories, the living cost indexes again. All the jargon gets me, so just bear with me, please. Pensioner and beneficiary.
Yep.
So no small business in that.
So that's households whose main source of income is government pensions.
Yep. Then there's employees, which are adult working employees, including owner-managers of their own business.
No, I think it would be employees, not business owners.
So the figures I've got, one of my staff's done the research. There are 14 million people working for a wage or salary in Australia, including owner-managers of their own business entity.
Yes, so I think it's... we can come back to you on it, but I believe it's just whether or not they're earning a wage or a salary as an employee, not
as an employee of someone else.
As an employee of somebody else.
All right.
Yep.
So we may be wrong there. Then the next group is aged pensioners.
Yep. So they receive an age pension from the government. That's the main source of income for that type of household.
Other welfare, self-funded retirees, and as I said, I don't know if that's partial income. Oh, it's their main source of income. So it's
the main source of income is their self-funded. Is that they are a self-funded retiree? That is, they're not on the age pension.
Right. So where would small businesses, owner-managers fit, and contractors? They
don't really fit into the consumer price index or the living cost indexes because it's about households. So it's not about businesses, it's about expenditure by households.
What about small business owners, though? They have a house?
Well, yeah.
How do you capture them?
If that's their main source of income, I'm not sure. I'd have to check, but I don't think they're... Do you know, Lee, off the top of your head?
I'm trying to get a feel for how many people are in employees category. How many Australians are in there? And then where are the other people, working people, including small businesses, owner-managers, contractors, where do they fit? I'm trying to get a feel for how many Australians are affected by these figures, by the CPI.
Or covered by them, yes.
Yeah.
So from memory off the top of my head, I think it's about 24%. No, let me take that on notice because I'm not 100% certain.
We can come back to you, Senator. It'll certainly be the vast majority. So my understanding of the origins of these indices is we've sought to capture, I guess, the major household types depending on their main source of income. As Ms Marcotte went through, and indeed you went through in asking your question, one of the main sources of income is the pension for many people. For others, it might be earning a wage or salary. Others might be retired but don't use the pension, are self-funded. Others rely on government welfare payments. So they're the main categories of income, earning an income for household types, and we've built the selected living cost indices around those. But certainly happy to take on notice if we can provide you with sort of detailed breakdown of the composition for Australian households by those types.
Yes, if you could, please, because I'd like to know the owner-managers, because they're outside employees, but they're not in any of the other groups, contractors and small businesses who pay themselves. So. And I'd like to know how many people are in that employees group, how many Australians are affected by, when they hear the CPI, when they hear that their index, living cost index, is 6.2%, how many people does that apply to?
Yeah, certainly, Senator.
So you don't know that offhand? I'm not necessarily expecting you to, but I know you've got a lot. Okay. So it doesn't include contractors that are listed in your characteristics of employment page? Purely employees?
Yeah, I mean, I need to check because I haven't looked into that for a while, but I need to check where those people are classified or whether they're just not covered by any of those indexes.
So as I said, there are in data set 6336 working arrangements shows there are 14 million people working for a wage or salary in Australia. So that means there are 14 million people, and that I presume is the largest group within your living cost indexes. Is that correct?
That would make sense.
Yeah, I would assume so, Senator.
Yeah. So what's the next largest group? And we haven't got... Well, what's the next largest group of the ones I called out? Pensioner and beneficiary, employees, age pensioners, other welfare, self-funded retirees.
Again, I'd have to check because that information comes from actually comes from the household expenditure survey and the survey of income and housing. So in those surveys, we go out and we ask people what they earn from a whole bunch of different income sources. So that might be superannuation, or it might be wages, or it might be, all the different sorts of income that you can have. And then from there, we aggregate all of those things together to see what's the main source of income for that household. So I'll have to go back and have a look at those particular surveys to figure out what the actual numbers that fit into each of those categories are. So
we've agreed that the employees category living cost index contains the largest number of Australians, that's 14 million, and we are guessing, what would be the second largest roughly? Pensioners, beneficiary, age pensioners, other welfare, self-funded retirees or small businesses? There are millions of small businesses.
So rather than taking a stab at that, Senator, I think it's probably better if you're comfortable for us just to give you the figures on.
Yeah, I
on
value
those.
accuracy, so I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
This is not a trap or a gotcha. So it would be around about, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, $14 million people plus other groups, pretty large groups, say 3/4, 2/3 of the Australian adult population is looking at the CPI, which is 3.8%, and thinking what's going on because their inflation rate is actually 6.2%.
Yeah, so Senator, it might be useful, I think, if we take a step back and just briefly talk through the differences between the CPI and the selected living cost indices. So I'll get my colleagues to expand on the detail, but I think one point to keep in mind is that no single index will serve every purpose, and indeed that is why we produce many different indexes of inflation. So what the CPI does is it measures the change in the prices of goods and services purchased by households. Now, a lot of people use that as a proxy for change of the cost of living, but the concepts are actually a little bit different, and that's precisely why we produce these separate selected living cost indices, and I think we've been doing that since the late 1990s. Now, there's two principal differences at a high level between the selected living cost indices and the CPI. One is the weights we use to aggregate the prices of individual goods and services into an index. So for the CPI, we use weights based on household spending patterns in the 8 major capital cities, or the eight capital cities. Whereas for the living cost indices, we use weights that reflect the spending patterns of the particular household type, and we went through those different household types.
Yep.
The other big difference is, it gets a little bit technical, about using an acquisitions approach for the CPI versus an outlays approach for the cost of living indices. But the key point of difference is the treatment of housing. And I think we might have discussed this at estimates
I'll come on to that again
previously. So with housing, for the CPI, we separate the cost of housing into, well, we think about there being two components. One is land, which is an asset or an investment, which isn't included in the CPI. The other is the cost of building new structures, so a new house. So that's what we capture in the CPI, and we also, of course, capture the rents for those that are renting properties. Now, for the living cost indices, as I said, that follows the outlays approach, and for that we include the outlay a household needs to in part in order to acquire the house, and for many households that involves a mortgage. So we include the mortgage interest costs in compiling the...
But not the cost of the house, just the mortgage
That's
interest
right,
cost.
just the mortgage interest costs. So I don't know whether you want to correct the record or expand on any of that detail.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, one is the concept that you've sort of bought it at the time, so you bought the house in the first period that you're trying to measure and comparing to the next period, and the assumption is that you've bought the whole house then, whereas obviously most people don't pay for the house up front, so that's kind of the difference between the living cost indexes, because the living cost indexes are how much are you paying to continue to have that asset, and for people who've bought it using a mortgage, then obviously they have to pay interest charges on that mortgage. So that's the big differences.
So am I right in thinking that it's misleading for so many people? I'm guessing 2/3, 3/4, 80% of the Australian population is actually facing 6.2% cost increase, whereas the CPI tells them it's 3.8. When they go to the supermarket, they think this is not right. When they think about their home payments, this is not right.
So I certainly wouldn't say it's misleading, Senator. They measure different things. So when it comes to supermarket prices, for example, they're measured the same.
No, I accept that. I accept that. But most people overwhelmingly would say CPI, that tells me how much it's going up. But they're saying it's going up by way more than 3.8%. So without an explanation of the CPI versus employees' living cost index, most people are saying this is not right.
Yeah, so I guess one way I think about it is when mortgage interest rates are stable, CPI and living cost indices broadly move in line with each other. But because of the different treatment of housing, when mortgage interest rates are either going up or going down, there will be a divergence between the two indices.
So how do you justify, without explaining it to people so they understand what's going on, how can we justify using a measure that does not reflect the actual inflation rate for a significant proportion of the population?
So like I said, Senator, it really comes down to the purpose behind the particular index. So the CPI, one way of thinking about the CPI is that it's a macroeconomic measure to inform government inform the Reserve Bank of Australia.
Economists, people making policy decisions in industry.
That's right. And what we try and pick up there is the pure price change. And I don't know, previously we've talked about how we capture things like shrinkflation and other quality adjustments. So it's very important that we capture the pure price change, which is what the CPI tries to do. And we've gone through the different treatment in housing as well. So it really comes down to the purpose for which or what question you're trying to answer, I guess, as to which indice you should use.
Okay, so I'm guessing most Australians would think, I want to know how much it's affecting me, so they go to the CPI, but the actual living cost index is much higher. Can we come to something else that's a big cost burden on people and also a joy? Children. Looking through your methodology, we didn't see a lot there about children. The Australian Institute of Family Studies put out a measure in 2018 of how much it costs to raise a child, finding that it cost $340 a week to raise 2 children, a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old boy, 6-year-old girl and a 10-year-old boy. Was that Australian Bureau of Statistics data, and is there any inflation time series around the cost of raising children?
So I'm not personally familiar with that data.
No, I don't think. Well,
so the ABS
I think you gave us a source, and it wasn't the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
No, it was the Australian Institute of Family Studies. Did they rely upon you?
Oh, they may do. I'm not sure without looking at their thing.
But
I think it would be fair to say that, though, going back to the price indexes, so this doesn't have a level of spending in it. It's obviously about the change in prices. So to the extent that people are buying things for their children, like toys or childcare or anything like that, then all of that is covered by the CPI and the living cost indexes.
But you can't tell how much inflation is around the cost of raising a child?
No, we don't put out a separate index that's just for things that are bought for children, no.
How does your data help a family quantify how much the inflation rate is impacting on their household?
So if you really wanted to, you could pick out different parts of the index and combine them together. So if you wanted to combine, say, food and childcare expenses and toys or whatever else it is that related to having a child, then you could do that. But really the bottom line is that the CPI is not actually about individual types of households or individual people. It represents the whole household sector.
So I'm just wondering how parents judge their spending, forward plans, wage and salary demands and decisions around having children on that measure, how much kids cost. How do parents understand their inflation rate from your data? Because I would think it would be a very good KPI for politicians to assess how much it costs to raise a child. But that's not possible.
Well, there's two different things, right? So there's how much does it cost to raise a child, which is the dollar amount of things. Like that's kind of a level. You know, it's that you pay $20 for a toy versus the price index, which is saying how much has the price for that toy changed. So there's kind of two different things. But
I understand.
One of the things that you can do is you can look at your household budget and you can see. So if your household is spending, you know, of its budget X percent on food, then you could use our indexes to show how much your particular household, the prices that you're spending are changing.
So just to expand on that briefly, Senator, we have 11 groups in the CPI and 87 expenditure classes. So you can certainly look up the ABS website and look through the price change for each of those 87 expenditure classes. We also, I think I'm right in saying, we publish the weights for each of those classes as well. So you can see the weight that is used in the CPI, and people can make their own assessment as to whether how much they spend is higher or lower.
Thank you. So let's move on to housing. ABS dataset that's titled Residential Property Price Index has been discontinued. So I can see an index called Total Value of Dwellings, with the emphasis on value. The summary page doesn't provide any usable information to anyone trying to find out how much the average price has gone up. We can get that data if I download the spreadsheet 6432 and work it out for ourselves, yet that's not reported. Is there a simple visual representation of house price inflation in each state to which the people can refer?
Yes, so we discontinued that because there are a number of other sources that give that very similar type of information. So CoreLogic is one, Domain is another.
They're
so,
private companies, are they?
That's right, but they use the same methodology as we used to use when we did the residential property price indexes. So effectively they were putting out the same information a bit earlier. So we were getting all of our information from them and then republishing it.
So do you republish it now?
No, we've discontinued the residential property price index
So
publication.
why did you stop? Could they do it more quickly?
That's right.
What are the hurdles there? Because I would have thought no one would be able to do it more quickly or better than ABS.
Well, they get information from they get information from all of the sales that are made, either through the valuer generals or other data sources like realestate.com. They basically were able to put it together much faster than us. And in fact, the source of the information in the residential property price indexes and the total value of dwelling stocks is CoreLogic.
Okay.
It's also the case that we need to make prioritisation decisions, and we make a judgment as to where we can add most value. And given the private sector sources available for residential prices, we made the judgment that we could add more value by reallocating the resources we have.
I've got no problem with the government saying leave it to the private sector, if that's the way they see it. If the mean price of a home in Queensland in 2020 was $524,000, and that same figure in 2024 is $815,000, per your data set 6432, column A, line 42, has that housing price inflation been captured in the CPI? I'm guessing not.
Well, a large component of that price inflation would reflect the increase in land prices. And as I said before, land is treated as an asset or an investment. So that component isn't captured in the CPI.
Can we break out land from housing construction or housing prices? You said it's not captured.
Yeah, well, we
price project
we do.
homes.
We price the cost of building a new home. And that the change in the price of building a new home reflects changes in the cost of building, either through materials or labour.
Right. I remember running an economic summit in my office. We hired a room in the Queensland Parliament building in 2017, and Dr. Alan Moran gave us some figures. He said the cost of building a house in Houston, Texas, at that time was the same roughly as the cost of building a house in Sydney. The huge differential in house prices was due to land. So is there some way that people can capture that? Because what we see, as I said, was that the mean price of a home in Queensland in 2020 was $524, and that same figure now in 2024 is $815. That's a hell of an increase.
So there's another part that goes to this. So the CPI is about changes in prices of the household sector, so what the household sector is purchasing from the business sector or the government sector. So the sale of existing houses between one household and the next effectively nets out, and there's no weight. They're not in the CPI because they're being sold from like me to Brenton.
So what you're saying is someone gets more money for selling it and someone has to pay more money for buying it.
That's right.
That's right, but they're both household.
But the one who's now
So
buying a property for the first time, compared to 2020, is now they're facing a 55% increase compared to their peers in 2020.
So, but there's somebody else in the household sector who sold it to them.
I get that. I get that.
So what remains is brand new houses, which is what we price. So brand new project homes is what we price, and we exclude land, as Brenton said, because that's an asset. So existing houses are excluded because the sales between one household and another household, and new households are represented by pricing project homes, but not the land.
What about someone who's bought a house in 2020 for $524,000 and sold it in 2024 for $815,000? So someone's paid the extra money, they've received the extra money for selling it, but they then have to go and buy another place So they're going to be, it's going to be captured anyway.
So
It needs to be
it
captured
just keeps
anyway.
netting out because it's between households. So you need to think about the CPI as representing price change for all households.
So it's not really representative of the individual.
That's right.
CPI is not representative for an individual.
That's right. That's correct.
So one of my favourite
I think that would be a surprise to many Australians. And not a criticism if that's the way your formula works, that's fine, but
So it's
a lot
not,
of people are relying upon your CPI figure.
So it's not because, for example, it has rents and new homes by owner-occupiers, and you can't conceptually you can't actually rent and buy a house for yourself, right? So conceptually the CPI does not represent any individuals because it's representing what all households in Australia are spending.
But it's in the aggregate of all
aggregate,
Australian
that's
households.
correct.
So some people are doing really well or not suffering, and other people are suffering and sleeping under bridges in Queensland, you know. So that's not your fault. I'm not trying to imply that. But you do capture mortgage cost changes, so let's consider that.
Yes.
If the average mortgage in the employee living cost index in 2020 was $500,000 and in 2024 is $800,000, do you show that as an increase in interest charges?
So yes, to the extent that mortgages have gone up, so then that would mean that you need to pay more interest. So there's two things that can make your interest payments higher, and that's one of them is the interest rate, and the other one's the amount of the size of your mortgage. So
Yep.
to the extent that people's mortgages have gone up or the interest rates have gone up, then both those things show up in the mortgage interest, the changes in the mortgage interest charge cost.
So both the interest rate and the higher mortgage.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to land tax. Victoria has increased their land tax by creating a $975 surcharge, wow, and a 0.1% increase in the rate. Does that increase factor into the CPI or LCIs?
Yes, we include property rates and charges in the CPI and the living cost indexes.
Not just rates, but all government charges, state, local government, local council?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to a question from June. In June Senate estimates, I asked about the change to the weighting for recreation and culture. Mr Gruen took that question on notice, and I have not received an answer. So I'll ask again. I'll just read the question as I stated it back in June. Is the last change of weighting, the weighting for the category of recreation and culture, increased by 16%? That category happened to be one of the leading disinflationary categories dragging down the CPI figure. Is the ABS telling Australians that in the middle of the worst cost of living crisis in decades, they're spending 16% more on recreation and culture than a year ago?
So first of all, I'd say apologies for not answering that question. I'm not quite sure how we missed it. But the main driver of that increase in the weight for recreation was people's travel overseas. So during the COVID pandemic, obviously not very many people were travelling overseas, so its weight came right down. But actually, if you look at the overseas arrivals and departures data that we publish, it shows that levels of travel overseas have returned almost to the same level that they were before COVID. So consequently, the weight for travel has gone back up to what it was, or
So it's
similar
gone up
to what it
off
was before COVID.
It's gone up off a low base.
Yes, that's correct.
Because of COVID.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is misrepresenting what's going on. It would be better to confer. I'm not questioning your methodology, but just for people to understand, it would be better to question something just before, compare it with something just before COVID.
In the submission,
It's difficult what you're doing, I take it.
I don't know whether you've got a copy of the submission we provided to this hearing, but
No, I haven't.
Well, when you get a chance to have a look at it,
My apologies.
No, you're fine. We've got a table that shows the weights.
One of my staff is up the back. We didn't get it. Thank you.
It's on page 5.
I'll just take the opportunity while you're preparing that to share the call.
Yes, sure.
Senator, we've been going
I'd like to come back on shrinkflation, but that's...
Of course. Senator Rennick, do you want to ask your question?